and welcome everybody to this event. It is the Iranian youth event to discuss the situation of human rights inside Iran and the feelings of the Iranian youth today inside and outside of Iran, how they feel about the situation there, and also about the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world. And thank you very much that you're all joining us to hear what the speakers have to say. I would like to very briefly introduce our speakers, and I give them a chance also to introduce themselves as well. Our first speaker is Mr. Moussa Zahed, and he's the Executive Director of the Middle East Forum for Development. And the second speaker then is Ms. Nargess Rahmanfard, and she's in fact a student from the United Kingdom, a psychological student as well. And also we have with us Ms. Samira Ardalani, who is also a medical student from Italy. So I would like to give each person a chance, first of all, to introduce themselves a little bit as well, and then we ask some questions and have some discussion about the situation of human rights inside Iran. So if I can begin with Moussa, first of all. Moussa, would you like to take the floor to say a few words as well? Introduce yourself.
Yes. Thank you for having me tonight, Hanif. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Moussa Zahed. I'm the Executive Director of Middle East Forum for Development. We are a non-governmental organization that operates independently here in the United Kingdom. We are London-based, and we have been campaigning for the human rights in the Middle East with focus on Iran and Iraq, but not limited to those countries. We have also been campaigning for example, human rights in Pakistan, and particularly for the ethnic and religious minorities there. Our campaigns include conducting research, drafting policy papers for parliamentarians, and doing a lot of advocacy work in order to try to gain the attention of parliamentarians for human rights situations, and through these channels affect the agenda of governments, which is not an easy task. Yeah. And so we do our best in that regard in order to be effective.
Thank you very much, Moussa. It is very, very good to hear that you are very active, campaigning with all the members of parliament and all of the politicians to get them involved, especially on the issue of human rights, and with a special focus you mentioned on Iran and Iraq. That is, I think, is very, very important. And I would like to also ask Nargess if you can just introduce yourself a little bit briefly as well. Thank you.
Hello, I just wanted to say thank you for having me. My name is Nargess Rahmanfard, and I'm a psychology student living in London in the UK. And I'm also a member of the Iranian youth organization in the UK.
Yes, that is excellent. And in fact, I know, Nargess, that you have been very active for the Iranian opposition in all of the activities. I've seen you in many of the events taking part there. So I know you are very much activist as well. Alongside your studies, you're doing a lot of activities for the human rights as well. And also, Samira, if you could also just briefly introduce yourself as well, please.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Samira Ardalani, and I am a medical student living in Italy. And I am also a member of the Iranian youth organization here in Italy.
Oh, that is great, and thank you very much that you're joining us from Italy, from the other side. The other two speakers, they are from London, so we have
thank you
from the different parts all over. And in fact, if we can, begin today's discussion about the situation of human rights inside Iran, and some of the one of the recent events which is coming up, is that on the June 14th, which is just a few days from now, it will mark the 3rd year since Hassan Rouhani took office as president of the Iranian regime. So maybe I can start with Moussa, who is also an expert in particular in these kind of matters as well. How would you assess the the record of Rouhani on the situation of human rights in particular in his last 3 years?
Yes. Well, in the wake of his presidency, he started with a charm offensive, and he raised with that charm offensive a lot of expectations, especially in the West, on the fact that he would improve the human rights situation in Iran. And 3 years after his presidency, we can see that nothing has changed. And in fact, if you compare Rouhani's record to his predecessor, Ahmadinejad, you see that he's executing more people. I mean, you know, to brand these people, to brand Rouhani and his cabinet as moderate, it's a mistake to do that. And the executions have been rising. Last year, 2015, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in Iran has said that at least 966 individuals have been executed. These are recorded executions. There are probably more than that. And these mark the highest number in nearly 2 decades of executions within the Islamic Republic of Iran. Freedom of speech, freedom of association have been severely curtailed under his tenure. We see a lot of arbitrary arrests of human rights defenders, journalists. Iran has in fact been recognized as the biggest prison of women journalists in 2016. And trade unionists that are being arrested, and others who have been, you know, charged on the very famous charges of forming a threat against national security or for propaganda against the state, which are very vague and broad charges. So I would assess the human rights situation in Iran not good, and it has actually deteriorated under Rouhani and his cabinet.
Thank you very much, Moussa. I think you made very important points there in your comparison, in particular with also the fact that you said that the execution rate has become higher than during Ahmadinejad's tenure since the time that Rouhani has taken office. And maybe if I can ask Nargess as well, also on the situation of human rights in Iran. I mean, generally, maybe you have some experiences about the human rights violations, both before Rouhani. Generally, I mean, how bad the human rights situation has been, and also during Rouhani's time. How do you yourself think? I mean, do you think that the situation has got any better or worse, or what do you think?
I think that as an Iranian youth, I'm not happy with Rouhani's record, but I think that I wasn't very much expecting him to be better than any of the presidents who were before him. And I think, as Moussa said as well, one thing that definitely stands out is the number of executions committed under Rouhani's power. On average, there's, I think, one execution every 8 hours. So there have been over 2,000 executions in the last 3 years. And it is mostly the young generation that suffer and the women who suffer. I myself had an uncle who was executed many years ago, I think. And he was also very young. He was part of the young generation who was executed at the age of 19 because of his political beliefs as well.
Thank you, actually, Nargess, that both for your insight in this and also for sharing your experience, your personal experience that you and your family have also gone through. I think this is very important for the world to know the tragedies that the Iranian families have been facing inside Iran at the hand of this regime. Also, maybe if I can ask Samira as well on a similar theme, because in fact, Nargess, she was mentioning that every 8 hours there's an execution inside Iran. And also Moussa was mentioning that, you know, even the trade unionists are arrested. So obviously there have been, you know, a lot of violations being stepped up during Rouhani's time. But also in particular, what Nargess said is that the regime is targeting a lot of the youth. So I was just wondering, maybe if you can also, because this was the second question that we had received, why you think that the Iranian regime in particular is targeting the youth in its crackdown?
The reason why the regime is targeting the youth is because the youth has always had the potential for making changements in society, and all changements in history have been made thanks to the young generation. And the truth is that the regime is afraid of young people, of young Iranians, because they have nothing, they have no rights. And the regime knows that in any moment they could rise up, and tries to avoid this by repressing them and by showing that if you violate their rules, you will pay a high price for that. And we can see that the number of juvenile offenders who are executed is quite high. Since April the 10th, there have been at least 120 executions, and 2 of the victims of the executions are believed to have been juvenile offenders. And only in 2015, there were at least 21 executions of minors.
This is very, very important points that you made, actually, Samira. I think it is very, very telling that even in the 21st century, that the regime is still hanging people who are under the age of 18. As you mentioned, just 2 in the past month. So this is a staggering record. And maybe then I can ask Moussa on this as well. I mean, from your perspective, since that you have been evaluating the situation of human rights and generally inside Iran as well, why do you think that I mean, what do you think of the situation of the youth in general, and why also you think that this regime is targeting the youth inside Iran?
I think that when you look at Iran, you see that every new generation that comes, because the regime, the mullah's regime, has been ruling for more than 3 decades, and every new generation that reaches a age where they start to think about their future and assess their environment and realize that they're being suppressed by the establishment, that they rise up, and they're really well aware of it. And I do believe, I do agree with Samira as well that you know, the youth, they form the force for change. And the reality is that in Iran also, what needs to be mentioned is that the regime, one of the main victims of this mullah's regime are women. And women in Iran are also, first of all, the population is very young in Iran, and very well educated, and the majority of those who are educated are women. So they form a serious threat to a reactionary establishment of Islamic fundamentalism. And so they're rightfully seeing them as a threat, because that's a force that wants change, and it's a very effective force. So the regime realizes that, and you know, steps up its pressure and crackdown on them in order to prevent them from gatherings, participating in you know, demonstrations, or even silencing them, like online commenters. During the past 3 years of Rouhani's administration, 100 netizens have been arrested and detained by this regime. We see that, for example, most recently, Nargess Mohammadi, who's a campaigner against the death penalty.
Yeah.
She's already in prison. She's a prominent human rights activist, also a woman. She's been sentenced to serve a 10-year sentence of a 16-year prison sentence, on top of the current sentence that she's serving in prison already. And for what? I mean, for, you know, peaceful activism and for seeking the civil rights of women in Iran.
That is a very, very important point that you made, Moussa, there as well. And if I can also ask Nargess as well, I mean, one of the points that Moussa just made is that he said that the majority of those people inside Iran who are educated, they happen to be women. And he also mentioned that a lot of the targeting of the regime is against the women when they're doing the crackdown. Just last week, we had a report that even some students, both men and women, but students who just graduated from their university, they were taken by the regime and they were each, I think, lashed 99 times. I think 35 of them. Perhaps you have heard of this case, Nargess, as well. Why do you think that the regime is doing that? Why are they, lashing the students now? What is the reason for this?
I think that I definitely agree that the Iranian regime is very much afraid of the Iranian youth, because it's the Iranian youth who yearn for the freedom, and they are fed up of the restrictions and the suppressions against them. And they weren't doing anything that's seen as illegal in any free country. There were a group of 35 students, I think last week, who were given 99 floggings each for attending a mixed gender party. And I think if you ask anyone in a European country, in a free country, that's ridiculous. Because the Iranian regime knows that it's the Iranian youth who can truly change them. And for example, we saw after the 2009 elections, the post-election uprisings, the youth were the epicenter of those uprisings, and they can very much do it again.
Yes, I happen to very much agree with you on this. In fact, if I can ask Samira as well, because I think that this situation of the floggings that the regime has been doing, it has been very much appalling, and I think it has, caught some international attention as well. I think it was the United Nations Human Rights Top Commissioner who condemned the recent floggings that actually Nargess was just referring to right now. There was also another case that some workers, just because they had protested for their rights and for the dismissal of their colleagues, a group of them, they were also arrested and they were also flogged as well by the regime. And we heard also just recently another case that another group of workers have also been sentenced to flogging. Why do you think that, because I see that, for example, when the issue of flogging comes up by, for example, by Daesh and the fundamentalists in the other parts of the Middle East, it catches a lot of the international attention and there's a lot of condemnation, quite rightly. So when the Iranian regime is doing similar kind of things to workers or to students, what do you think of this? And what do you think that what the international community, how should they respond to this?
The UN's position against these flogging, but I think that international community should condemn it strongly, and they should stop making deals with Iran, or at least put the conditions of the respect of human rights when they make deals. Because Iran needs to make deals, so because there's a very bad economic crisis in Iran right now. So it could be a good way to try to reduce, if not to stop, the number of executions and the violation of human rights which take place every day in Iran.
Yes, I see. So what your suggestion is basically that because the Iranian regime is dependent on the foreign currencies, and the foreign deals, then such deals should be made conditional upon improvement of human rights inside Iran.
Yes.
Yes, I think this is a very good point as well. And if also maybe I can, because actually Samira, she mentioned about the deals between the West and also with the Iranian regime, economic deals. If I can ask Moussa as well on this, some people say that, for example, that Rouhani is a moderate, or he has moderate tendencies. They point to the nuclear deal and they say that the West should now deal with Iran, consider that the Iranian regime is becoming a more moderate, and they should reach out to Iran. So from your perspective, from how you have been monitoring the situation of both the human rights inside Iran and also Iran's relationship with the rest of the international community, what do you think is the right solution for this?
Well, I think the I've heard the arguments. I was never convinced by them, to be honest, because the issue is that maybe because I'm myself an Iranian, that we realize what the true nature is of this regime. Our parents have experienced this regime. We have been experiencing this regime. This regime has been ruling more than 3 decades, and we have seen various faces coming and going, and we have heard various narratives of these faces. One was the hardliner, one was the moderate. The reality is that there are mechanisms in order to force or to pressure the regime into respecting the international core human rights treaties, to which Iran is, to many of them, a party of. And these mechanisms should be used in order to, as I agree with Samira, in any future intensification of relationships with the regime. It should be contingent upon actually the improvement of the human rights situation there. Actually, from my own experience, I can say that we have been active in the Netherlands on a specific issue regarding ethnic and religious minorities in Pakistan. And the Netherlands was one of the countries that was basically promoting an intensification of doing a lot of deals with Pakistan and allowing Pakistan to enter the European business market. And we basically used the European mechanism as an argument for the Dutch government to use in the setting of the Council of European Council of Ministers in order to pressure Pakistan into respecting the human rights of these ethnic and religious minorities. And I mean, the situation in Pakistan hasn't changed. That will be the ideal outcome for it. But at least they raise the issue, and the Pakistanis know that there's a condition for them to enter the European market. And that is that we have to respect and abide by international law. Now with Iran, we should do the same thing. And I think that Iran has oil and gas, so I understand that it's these are lucrative contracts, and it's very, very tempting for these companies to close their eyes to the human rights violations that take place there. But the reality is that we in Europe, we stand for certain values that have been fought for after Second World War, and we should not repudiate them for short-term business interests in Iran. And apart from that, what I would like to point out as well is that Iran is also externally creating a lot of havoc. I mean, they are supporting terrorist proxies in the region. They are destabilizing the region with their interferences in Yemen, Syria, in Iraq, by supporting the Houthi forces in Yemen, by supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Shia militias in Iraq. So instead of rewarding them with these business contracts and all these intensification of relationships and branding these this cabinet of Rouhani as moderates, we should pressure the regime to respect international law and to improve the human rights situation there.
Thank you very much, Moussa. I think this is a very, very valid points that you made, and in fact, of course, I personally agree with what you mentioned about how the West it can pressure the regime through these mechanisms that is available to it, including forcing it to respect the human rights if it wants some kind of relations. And if I can ask Nargess as well, because in fact both Samira and Moussa, they mentioned that the West should condition its deals with the Iranian regime on the respect for human rights, first of all. And I think this is a very good argument that they made. But recently there have been a number of trips by European officials to Iran, and sometimes by the Iranian regime's officials to Europe. I wanted to get your perspective as an Iranian youth. Because I know you are very, very active both in the as an Iranian youth in Britain. As I said, I've seen that you have participated in virtually all of the Iranian opposition's gatherings and all the events everywhere. And so From your perspective, as an Iranian youth, what do you think about these negotiations and goings and comings with the European countries and Iran?
Well, I think that the most important thing is the Iranian people's rights, and these trips made by the Iranian regime officials and the European officials have not been helpful for the Iranian people's rights. Otherwise, I think we would have seen positive results by now. There have been no changes whatsoever for the human rights condition. In fact, it's probably worsened. The executions have risen, as we mentioned. The laws are more restricting, especially on women. They have stationed morality police to further restrict women. And overall, these visits have done nothing whatsoever for the Iranian people. So I think that the best policy, and it's something that Mrs. Rajavi has also repeatedly mentioned, the best policy is to stand up to the Iranian regime and not back down on anything. And if, as we said, if they do want to make negotiations and deals, then they should be, if they want to improve their relations with Iran, then they should base that on whether Iran is willing to put a stop to their executions and the terrorizing of the Iranian people.
Thank you. Yes, I very much agree with you there. And also, Samira, if I can ask you a similar question as well, on the same grounds, because you're also part of the Iranian youth, also in Italy. I know that, for example, there was a big rally in Italy some time ago because the Iranian regime's president, he was coming to Italy, and also when the Iranian officials were going there, and also when the Italian Prime Minister, he was going to Iran as well. So what would be your opinion about these kind of comings and goings between the European countries and also the Iranian regime?
Well, I agree with Nargess. We have seen no changements, or better, we have seen them, but the situation has worsened. And unfortunately, when the President Rouhani came in Italy, the Italian government didn't really insist on the problem of the violation of human rights in Iran. And this is a mistake because when the Iranian government saw that it could do whatever he desired to do in his own country, he even worsened the situations, as Nargess said, and the number of executions increased, and they should stand against the dictatorship in Iran, or at least they should try to insist on not violating human rights, because otherwise they will only encourage human rights violations and executions, as they already have. Because we saw that when Mrs. Mogherini went, visited Iran, there were many executions in the same days in which she was in Iran. So I think this is something that must be stopped.
Yes, I think this is a very, very important point that you made. And in fact, you mentioned also that when the European Union's foreign policy chief, Mrs. Mogherini, she went to Iran, I think on the same day, you're right, that there were a number of executions and collective executions, which was, something that is maybe some of the European countries, they didn't expect this. And Moussa, if I can ask you as well, I mean, you mentioned also, for example, that your activities that you have done in the Netherlands and also in Britain, the activities, the campaignings that you have been doing to promote the issue of human rights. I mean, if you wanted to, for example, be addressing the European officials on how to, what policy they should have to Iran, given the fact that this regime, has, as you mentioned, and as Nargess and Samira also mentioned, that the human rights situation has got worse in Rouhani's era. What would be your message to the European officials from your perspective?
Yeah, I would like to refer to a slogan that the Iranian people during 2009, when there was an uprising in Iran, an uprising for democratization, as I call it. And the slogan was very loud and clear. It was in Farsi. It was Obama, ya ba una ya ba ma, which translates into Obama, you're either with us or with them. And I think this is very telling, also in regard to your previous question. When representatives of this regime come to the European capitals and negotiate with European leaders, and human rights is not being discussed at all, I think that has a very demoralizing effect on the people in Iran, and they realize that as well. What I would say, what my message would be to the international community, to Western leaders with regards to the Iranian regime, is that the only language that they understand is consistency, and you have to be consistent, just as you were consistent in pressuring this regime into coming to the negotiations table for the nuclear deal that they had last year. They should definitely push this regime on the human rights record and make any intensification of relations with Iran based on the condition that the human rights situation, the improvement of human rights situation in Iran could be observed. This is a crucial matter, and they owe that to the Iranian people, and especially to the youth, to the Iranian youth who have so many aspirations and desires and wishes which they can't fulfill under the current mullah's dictatorship.
You're right, Moussa, and thank you very much that you mentioned this. And also, if I can ask Nargess as well. I mean, just as an Iranian